Alright guys, welcome back to your economic Armageddon update, and the craziness is just getting worse. Now we have a lot of things to cover today. We have a big bombshell update about Trump's tariff war. And even Trudeau right now, he's sounding the alarm bells. He is supposed to be the fanboy of the United States, and he's saying that Trump, well, he wants Canadian resources. And we have to talk about that. And at the end of the day, the big domino to fall will be the US auto industry. Whatever events Trump is unleashing on the world is going to lead eventually to the destruction of car making in the United States, not just in EVs but in ICE vehicles as well. Now, Trump's tariff war is about to escalate, and this is a big one. Donald Trump is now planning big reciprocal tariffs that will affect everyone. It's going to clobber the entire world, right? So what do we have going on? A reciprocal tariff is basically if you punish me with import taxes, I'm going to punish you with import taxes as well. So let's say China imposes a 10% tariff on US cars. For example, the United States will impose a 10% tariff back on China as well. Now, we all know that it's more than 10%, right? It's more than 100% if we factor in the 10% additional tax. So Chinese cars are, well, they're going to the United States at 110% tariff. And this is not good because a reciprocal tariff is going to affect every country around the world. So if your country, for example, if my country is Singapore, if your country, maybe it's Korea, maybe it's Australia, you guys impose a tariff on the United States, chances are they're going to clobber back as well. Now, his obsession on this tariff revolves around the US auto industry. He's really obsessed about getting his local cars made in the United States going into other countries. So, to facilitate that, he wants to tax foreign cars coming in. But here's a big problem that I want to ask everyone. When was the last time, if you're outside the US, you really saw a bunch of US cars rolling around, right? I don't really see much. There was a point where Trump he talked with the German Chancellor Merkel before, and he asked why aren't there any Ford and GM vehicles around Berlin, around Munich, and why are there BMs? Why are there Mercedes in US instead? Well, at the end of the day, it all boils down to the consumer, doesn't it? US cars, they are known to be rather inefficient, bad fuel economy, and the EU, of course, has a 10% tariff on US cars. So when it comes to decision making, when push comes to shove, obviously Europe is going to favor their own domestic brands. It's not a surprise here, and that's why US cars aren't coming. Now, Trump telling the world that the era of tariffs is here is basically an announcement that the old world order is done. Now, the 1970s to the 1980s world order was quite simple, right? The United States would send all the dollars for goods, and in the meantime, the world will just give all the goods to the United States. Now, what Trump wants is for everything to be made in the US. So this is going to cause a ton of problems. Now, firstly, as we said, a strong dollar is going to rise. That's why over the past few weeks, we have seen the dollar index go higher and higher, and global currencies from the euro all the way to the Canadian loonie to the Mexican peso, they've been collapsing. Now, the issue here with Trump's hypothesis, with his idea of reshoring US manufacturing, is that US manufactured goods are just not competitively made in the United States. Now, even if countries around the world they lower their tariffs to the US, maybe it comes from 20%, 10% goes all the way down to zero, there are many alternatives out there. The world isn't starved for cars. We just need to look at China. They have brands like NIO, they have brands like BYD, all the way from Shanghai, all the way from a factory in Shenzhen in Beijing. At the end of the day, right, the big loser of this reciprocal tariff war is going to be the EU. They will have to drop their car tariffs because they have much more to lose than America. Remember the relationship we said before. They export a lot of BMs and Mercedes into the US, right? And there are very few American cars in Europe. Doesn't matter if it's France, doesn't matter if it's Germany, very few vehicles rolling around. Germany alone exported around $30 billion worth of vehicles to the US last year or in 2023. So they have to drop the tariff rate. Remember that the US, this market is quite, how do I say, in a sense, it is the promised land for G7 countries because the US is actively trying to block Chinese exports from coming in. So G7 countries, especially Japan, Germany, they sell cars, they can just sell it in without getting clobbered. But this window of opportunity is going to close. And the issue with just a 10 or 25% tariff is that it can actually eat up all the profit margins of car manufacturers in Germany, car manufacturers in Japan, because their cost of manufacturing is so high thanks to high energy costs. And we all know that Germany is not going to go back to Russia for cheap energy anytime soon. It's not going to happen because if they do it, essentially they're just going to admit to the whole world that all the decision making in the past 2 to 3 years of sanctioning Russia was wrong. And how do you think that's going to affect the political chances of getting re-elected? Not very well, I would assume. But this is the problem with Europe dropping the tariffs on US cars and just bowing down and rolling over to Trump. This concession will lead to even more open doors, right? Trump, well, he has a reputation of pushing and pushing and pushing, and if he gets something that he wants, he'll likely push again. Maybe not tomorrow, but a few months down the road, a few years down the road. And most likely, he wants Europe to buy expensive US LNG, liquefied natural gas. Trump wants to liquefy natural gas in the United States, put it on a ship, set it halfway across the world, past the Atlantic, all the way to Europe, and he wants Europe to pay top dollar for it. Because after all, the US is now facing the real threat of Canada snatching their gas market share in 2025 and beyond. This is something that we covered a few days before. Canada, well, they finally seen the light, right? They realize that they are actually subsidizing the United States. They are selling a ton of cheap oil, cheap commodities, cheap gas to the US. And maybe it's time right now to diversify their customers. Just a radical thought, right? Maybe it's better to sell to more than just one single customer. Now, what's very interesting is what Trudeau said, what he reportedly said over the past few days. He's freaking out over the US, and in a business summit, he actually told the audience the unthinkable that the US might have a real desire to annex Canada. Now, we know that Trump has talked about the Canadians, Canada being the 51st state of the United States. A big desire is perhaps to take over Canada's abundance of critical minerals. Now, Trump's claim to make, Canada the 51st state is being taken seriously, and well, he has used economic force. He has thrown tariffs of 25% on Canada, and well, Canada did, you know, give in to a certain degree. Now, let's not forget that Canada has over 30 critical minerals needed for EV batteries. Talking about smartphones as well as defense gear. Everything from nickel to gallium to germanium to lithium. Now, what does this sound like to you? This sounds like rare earth metals, critical minerals needed for the industries of tomorrow, right? You need these metals to create solar panels, you need these metals to create semiconductors, and you also need these metals to build EVs, which is exactly what every growing economy needs of tomorrow, especially Trump. Remember the grand plan, right? Let's bring back manufacturing to the United States. So Trump will need that. Now, Canada is already selling cheap gas to the US at a 10 to 20% discount. So we can expect them to also sell their rare earths, all the critical minerals to the US at a discount as well. It won't surprise me. But it seems to Trudeau that Trump wants even more. He's not really interested in just getting a 10 to 20% discount. Because if you look at Canada versus the United States, Canada only has a population, correct me if I'm wrong, 40 to 50 million people. And the landmass of Canada is much bigger. Why so little people? Well, the weather being extremely cold is one. There's a lot of mountains around as well. So if you compare Canada's resource per capita, how much resource they have under the ground, rare materials, rare earths, rare metals, oil and gas per person is much more versus the United States, which has a population of like 380 to 400 million or something like that. So you can kind of see the desire, the agenda swirling around Trump's head, right? Now, the US already takes in a lot of cheap Canadian gas as well. So you just imagine how much of a big advantage the US will have if somehow they manage to absorb Canada by any way possible, right? Let's say it's just somehow Trump gets Canada, right? What will this mean? Basically, a ton of resources will flow into the United States. Now, just take natural gas, for example. 99% of US gas imports, they come from Canada. And that's over $20 billion in 2022. Now, this allows the US to have a big abundance of gas supply. What does this do? It helps to satisfy their own domestic demand for power generation, and all this excess gas, it helps them with enough supply to export expensive LNG to the world. And this includes to Japan and, of course, to our favorite customer in the world, Europe. So the US is making a lot of money on the back of Canadian commodities. Trump basically wants Canada to subsidize his economy in every single thing. But this situation is gonna backfire. You can bet your bottom dollar on it. Now, Canada, they are moving to secure their trade with the EU, not just China, not just Japan. Canada is now flipping the national security argument against the US, which I find it hilarious, right? Everything at the end of the day can be justified by national security. Sooner or later, the US, they're going to ban Chinese toilet paper from coming in because of national security. Now, we mentioned before how the EU lacks cheap energy. Everyone knows this by now, right? I think it should be written in every history book going forward. And that's why they are deindustrializing. A lot of companies like BASF, which is a chemical company, they are moving to China. They're actually having more success there. And VW Volkswagen, they are moving to the United States and they're bringing thousands of jobs with them. So Europe, they need Canadian energy. And there's a good chance they might get tariffed by the United States. Europe could be punished even further, right? So this is gonna cripple the entire industrial base. It's not a good ending for them. Remember that the EU exports to the US a lot, and that accounts for 20% of their total exports or 5% of their GDP. Now just think about this, guys. At what rate is Europe's economy is growing? Now, I would argue that it's 1 to 3% at the most, and I'm being very conservative. I'm being extremely polite. So, if 5% of the GDP will be compromised, this is enough to send many economies, especially Germany, into a prolonged recession. It's not going to be nice. They also can't compete with China at the end of the day. But if we look across the pond, so as to speak, Canada is a resource-rich country. They can help Europe get back on their feet and they can earn more revenue at the same time. Now, not as good as buying Russian commodities, but we know Europe doesn't want to talk to Putin. So this is going to be the best compromise so far. Canada supplying Europe is going to be a real possibility here, guys. This allows them to sanction-proof themselves against the US. Canada can grow their resource export business and EU's industries, well, they get another day to survive. Which brings us back to the big fallacy Trump is talking about. Now, Trump thinks that this will help to revive the US auto industry. And just to this morning, he's going to slap the world with additional tariffs on steel and aluminum as well. But this is going to actually doom it instead. We'll cover that topic tomorrow in another video. But I want to talk about the US auto industry today. Now, when Trump first threatened Canada and Mexico, well, car prices in the US, they were facing a $3,000 increase. So a $3,000 increase means a 5 to 20% increase in car prices, right? And that's going to price out a lot of American families, a lot of American businesses looking to get new auto vehicles. And a 25% tariff would be massively unprofitable, and US consumers will suffer. Now, the end game at the end of the day, is for factories in Canada and Mexico to move back into the United States. However, this won't lead to increased competition, right? You won't really see brands like Ford, GM, and Tesla fighting it out with each other. Unlike China, they don't have the Hunger Games competitive spirit. They'll sit back, chances are they'll go fat and they go lazy as well. And let's not forget a lot of foreign brands like Toyota, Nissan, VW, they all build their cars either up north or down south. And what's hilarious is that GM, which is an American brand, is the biggest car maker in Mexico. So if Trump goes ahead with this, he's going to damage the US auto industries instead. It'll be end of the industry. They can never be competitive again. Now, US consumers, of course, they'll get their cars, but they'll pay more. And the US will lose the ability to make affordable cars for global exports. So it is just one big disaster, and the boomerang is already coming back to clobber Trump's economy. So if the US closes off car exports to its market, the big winner will be, well, China. Tariffs, they're going to cost automakers in excess of $40 billion a year in damages. And countries, they won't stand for this. They will find alternatives. Firstly, Latin America and BRICS, they are growing markets. Canada also buys nearly 2 million vehicles a year. What will this do? China will simply swoop in and replace US or Japanese factories. US automakers will be so behind the eight ball this time in both cost and technology as well. And what will this do? Guys, this is going to lead to the death blow of the US auto industry.